So without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Jess Popplewell. Jess is a careers consultant at Imperial College London, working most closely with the departments of physics and electronic and electrical engineering. She got a postgraduate diploma in careers education from Warwick University, specialising in higher education, and has been advising early career researchers as a careers professional since 2016. Outside of her work at Imperial, Jess has degrees in English literature and creative writing, with her first novel coming out in summer 2024. Her talk today will walk you through the process of composing an academic CV and making sure that it helps you stand out from the crowd. I've seen some of this talk before, and it was really eye-opening to see what you can do to boost your visibility for recruitment. So I know everyone's waiting, and so I'll hand over to you, Jess.
Thank you very much, and what a lovely introduction. I hope I live up to such pleasant words. Thank you very much for being here, everybody. As George just said, my name is Jess, and I am a careers consultant at Imperial. Unfortunately, this lovely view you can see behind me isn't real, but I can actually see that tower from my office window at work. So it's all, we can pretend, we can use our imagination. So today I'm going to be talking about writing academic CVs, something that I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, will need to do at some point on your journey throughout your career. And what I want to focus on today are kind of these areas. So first of all, understanding what the similarities and differences are between academia versus industry, because if you can identify that in your CV, it might just help you figure out what you want to put into your CV. That means we're going to talk about two different types of academic CVs, the traditional, and also you may have heard this term floating around recently, narrative CVs. So we're going to talk about both of those. And then right at the end, I've got some kind of overall tips, including some ideas and things to think about when we consider the recent use that has appeared all over the media of people using AI in various ways when they're considering CVs. I will say up front, I do not think there is anything ethically wrong with you using generative AI to help you to craft an application. However, there are some absolute pitfalls that I have noticed in the past few months alone, many people falling into. So if I can help you avoid those, I will feel like I've done my job today. But before we dive in properly, I just wanted to kind of give you an overview of where your CV fits into the recruitment process. Now, this recruitment process that I have put on screen for you at the moment is a long recruitment process. This is typical in industry rather than academia and in the graduate job market. So if any of you ever actually decide to, I know it's a scary thing to say, but leave academia, you may find that you are at the beginning of a multi-stage recruitment drive where you will put your CV or maybe an application form in right at the beginning. And then you will be asked to jump through several flaming hoops to get to that final interview stage. And those hoops are called things like psychometric tests, coding challenges, video interviews, telephone interviews, assessment centres, presentation tasks. There is a lot that you might be asked to do. But you'll notice that the CV section is right at the beginning. This is a filtering exercise. So regardless of whether you do go through one of these really long processes, your CV is the very first opportunity that you have to make a positive impression. The same absolutely applies whether it's a smaller company or perhaps more relevantly here for things like postdocs. What very often will happen is you will submit a CV or an application form, you will be invited to interview, and if the interview goes well, excellent, you've been offered a job. So if you are staying in academia and you're looking at that kind of postdoc experience, it might be a lot simpler for you. But even so, it is still the case that your CV is your very first opportunity to make an impression. It is a marketing document, with that being, the case. So with all of that in mind then, what is the difference between what you might want to put on an academic CV versus one for industry? Some of you may have written industry CVs before, and I will say industry CVs sounds like a really formal term, but actually if any of you have ever put a CV into work in a bar, technically that was an industry CV. So some things to think about. Generally speaking, for industry, you would limit your CV to 1 to 2 pages. So if you're applying for roles in banking and finance or consulting or some tech roles, certainly the big American multinational firms like Google, Amazon, etc., you might certainly in some cases choose to use a one-page CV because sometimes those are kind of preferred by those industries. However, pretty much everybody else in industry happy with a two-page CV. And as somebody with research experience, actually 2 pages would probably always be fine for you, but you wouldn't want it to be any longer than 2 pages. The difference here is academic CVs will very often be longer than 2 pages. You might have a whole 3rd page that is just for conferences or for publications, etc. And as you go throughout your academic career, it might get longer and longer still, and that's generally fine. So that's a key difference between academic versus industry CVs. You will want to highlight relevant areas of your experience in either case, and in industry, that is likely to be professional experience, or if you were applying for a consulting job, you might have a consulting experience section, or a science writing experience if you were applying for a science communication role. Whereas in academia, you're probably going to have sections that say things like teaching experience, or publications, or conference experience, research experience. So actually the way that you lay out the information in your CV might be different depending on what it is you're applying for. Regardless, however you do this, whatever content you decide to put into it, the thought you should have should always be, what will this particular employer want to see? So I used to be a recruiter. I've been a recruiter for a local authority and the NHS in the past. And in both cases, I can tell you, recruiters don't have a huge amount of time. So you should always be thinking about, what does this person want from me? Because if I can give them that, if I can make their job easier, I'm going to put them in a good mood. And trust me, no matter what you're applying for, you want your recruiter to be in a good mood. Where possible, and this is a way of doing that, try to use the employer's language. So if you were applying for something in industry, you would probably avoid academic jargon. But if you're writing and applying for a role in academia, that's probably fine. You can assume a level of understanding of certain elements of jargon. However, it's worth noting, it actually might not be the academic, the supervisor that you're applying to who reads this CV. It could be somebody in human resources who's doing the shortlisting. So bear that in mind. You don't want to have your CV be so impenetrable in its language that somebody who isn't an expert in your field wouldn't be able to understand it at all. You may decide to have a summary section at the top. They're not actually usually required for an academic CV. So if you're not sure what that means, by the way, a summary section is, some people will have a bit at the top and they might call it a personal profile, or they might call it a career objective. And it's usually a few short, sharp sentences that describe who you are, as in what's your professional identity, what you're applying for, and that often explains how it ties into some of your most relevant skills or research interests. Not mandatory, you don't have to include one on an academic CV. In industry, there can be reasons to do so. I'm going to talk about whether or not it's AI readable a little bit later on in the presentation. Particularly in industry, this is a key consideration now. Most companies have the capacity to use what we call ATS, applicant tracking systems. They are essentially algorithms that your CV is put into, and it might give a numerical score based on how closely you meet the requirements of a particular job description. They're not massively sophisticated. They are trained on the keywords in the job description, which I think actually makes it easy to work with if you understand that. It's slightly less relevant in academia, but I don't know that that will always be the case. And I will talk about that a bit more later. So those are some of the key differences. And really what it comes down to is, your audience will be different for an industry CV versus an academic CV. And if you bear that in mind, you're probably going to do a good job. There are, of course, some similarities as well. So first of all, as I've mentioned before, this is your opportunity for first impressions. Now, with that being the case, no matter how long your CV ends up needing to be, your first page is the most important page. You should arrange it so that the best content you have falls there. So if you really want to show off, if you're applying for a lectureship position and you really want to show off that you've got teaching experience, it might be a good idea to get that on the first page. Or if you're applying for a research intensive role, your research experience might want to be on the first page. You want to get the stuff that you think is most impressive for that particular role as high up the page as possible, so it's easy to find. And no matter who you're applying to, you want to ensure that you are providing the specific evidence that they are asking for. And that's what I mean when I say to students regularly, oh, you should be tailoring your CV for different opportunities. All I mean by that is make the recruiter's job easier. They should be able to look at your CV and easily see the evidence for the specific things they have asked for in their job description. If you do that, you are going to score highly on your CV, whether that is a machine that's doing the scoring or whether it's a person. And obviously the people that score highly are the ones that get the interviews. And so I know when George introduced me, he talked about my background, my creative writing, all of that kind of stuff. The reason I think it's important to let people know about that when I do sessions like this is because I'm a storyteller at heart. And as a careers consultant, I think that's really important. Storytelling, everything you do in the recruitment process is storytelling. So the way that you use language can tell a really compelling story to an employer. And you have to remember that they weren't there when you did all of this cool stuff you're talking about on your CV. They weren't there when you were mentoring an MSc student through their thesis. So you have to set the scene. You have to tell the story of what you did and why it was valuable, because otherwise you cannot assume that somebody else will know that. Which, if that sounds a bit vague, don't worry. I'm going to go through some tips later on how you can do that storytelling. First of all, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read this particularly clearly, you can either come back to the recording and maybe pause it if you want, or you can actually go to, if you do an online search for Imperial Guide to CVs and Cover Letters, we have a guide that anybody can have a look at. It comes from our careers service. This is an example from the 2022 to 23 version of the Imperial Guide to CVs and Cover Letters. We've got loads of examples of different types of CVs. If you wanted to use that, you're very welcome to. So the things you will note about this is that it is 2 pages. So this is probably an early career researcher who doesn't have so much kind of publication or conference or teaching experience that she felt that she needed a 3rd page, but that's entirely up to you to decide. But despite it only being 2 pages, it's well, in fact, possibly because of that, it's easier to fit on a slide. It's really easy to see some of the positive things in this CV that I would recommend. First of all, the headings on here are all really clear. So I can easily, as a recruiter, find Samira's education, her publications data, any awards that she's been awarded, her research funding, conferences and invited talks she's spoken at, all of her technical skills and her impact activities. So if I was looking for her technical skills specifically, I can find them easily because the headings are really clear. It's a relatively simple structure, actually. And again, that is what I would recommend. It is easy to read quickly. Remember what I said before, recruiters of any ilk probably don't have a huge amount of time. If it is the hiring manager who is reading this CV, if that is somebody who does a lot of intense research or has a heavy teaching schedule alongside that, they don't have a huge amount of time to go through these CVs. So if you keep it clear and simple and make it easy to read, you're helping them, and that can only be a good thing. So avoid large blocks of text as well. You'll notice here that Samira's used lots of bullet points. They will draw the reader's eye to the relevant points that she's trying to make. Large blocks and paragraphs, in my experience as a former recruiter, just don't get read. The eyes skip over them and move to something that's easier to read. So bear that in mind. You will, if you do actually get a chance to look at the content in a bit more detail, you will also notice there is some focus here on measurements of success and research outputs. So there is definitely some quantitative data here to show what Samira has achieved. And there is also a little bit of focus here on some of what I would call the narrative features of Samira's experience. In that way, I would say that this is kind of a hybrid CV. It has some elements of a traditional academic CV, which are those very straightforward, these are the dates that I did this research, this is what the research was focused on, this is what the output was. But it also includes some other bits which are a little bit more about what Samira was actually responsible for at different times of her experience. I'm going to talk about narrative CVs in a couple of slides' time, so hopefully that will start to make a bit more sense when we do that. But it's worth noting that there are some typical things in terms of content that very commonly appear on academic CVs. Hopefully, if those of you that have already got your CV together will look at these and go, yep, that's all familiar to me. I recognise all of that. For those of you, fantastic. You can just sit here and be quite smug that you've achieved it. Anybody thinking, oh, I don't know if I would put that on, or I don't know if I have, maybe I should. This is just to show you that these are the kind of things you can include. So typically, obviously, people are going to need your name and your contact details. Unless you are applying for something that is blind recruitment, and a notable employer that does that is a civil service, they don't let you put identifying information such as which university you attended. They don't like that information. Pretty much everybody else does want your name and contact details. They also want elements of your education, particularly if you're early career. This is probably more relevant in some ways. If you've got loads and loads and loads of previous experience, your education doesn't always have to be the first thing that appears, but it's entirely up to you where you think it's most appropriate to put it. You might want to include publications, or if they're still in the process of actually coming out, you can have a planned publications section as well. Conferences, teaching experience, and references. But you also might include other things, and these are on the right-hand side of this slide, things like awards and prizes, funding, industry experience, academic service, and interests. They're not mandatory, but you might decide this shows off my breadth of experience and the things that I can do. So those are the kind of things that are really common to see. Oh, sorry, I got this blank page. So the first thing to think about, and this is can be really tricky for people, I know. Very often I find when I work with clients that actually starting the CV is the toughest bit, knowing where to begin. And in order to help you, what you can do is actually have a look at what the requirements are for the specific thing you're applying for. So what does your opportunity require? Whether that is a postdoc experience, whether it's a role in industry, or actually whether it is for some funding for your research. Some adverts might stipulate the kind of CV they want. So I'm going to talk about narrative CV shortly. The UKRI has some very specific requirements on their narrative CVs, and you can actually download all of the guidance from their web pages to see that. But others might not. They might just say submit a CV. And it can be really hard to know, okay, but what do you want from me on that CV? Sometimes they will tell you, there'll be a couple of little bullet points that will say, please include additional information such as a personal statement or a cover letter. And if that's the case, a traditional non-narrative CV might work quite well, because all of your narrative, the stuff around your specific responsibilities, could go into that personal statement potentially. If you're not sure what to do and you're worried about it, is there anybody you could ask? Do you know anybody that works in that research group already? And could you just reach out to them and say, look, what kind of CVs do they prefer here? Or get advice from a mentor, if you have one, that might be able to point you in the right direction of what might be hoped for. So if you do feel like you don't know where to begin, that's absolutely something to consider. If you don't have that and you're really stuck, I would probably recommend something like Samira's CV that I showed you a couple of slides ago. That's a sort of combination of the two. It includes all of that traditional quantitative information, but the bit of narrative in there as well to really highlight what her responsibilities were. But where I keep using this phrase, narrative CV, if you're not familiar with it, this has come from the Imperial website. We have a page where we talk about what narrative CVs are. And that webpage says that while different funders will have their own templates, and that's what I meant when I said sometimes they will tell you what they want, a narrative CV is essentially a CV format in an application that prompts written descriptions of contributions and achievements that reflect a broad range of skills and experiences. It's a change from the traditional purely metrics-based CVs, which are primarily just publication lists with employment and education history, but with no context. So basically what this is saying is a narrative CV will include your metrics, but there will also be context to show what was your contribution to that particular piece of research, for example, is essentially the difference. Now, I will tell you, I'm completely upfront about the fact that when I first saw this description of what a narrative CV was, my careers consultant heart asked the question, is that just not a normal CV? Because if you were writing for industry, I would absolutely recommend that you include context of your particular contributions. I would always recommend that. So in some ways, the advice for narrative CVs follows quite closely the advice we give for industry CVs, which is provide context. Tell us what you specifically did in a particular setting. But from your perspective, basically what it means is support every statement with evidence. So if you're able to say that you are excellent at presentation, you want to have something in there that says presented at conferences. I've done these poster presentations. These are the, if you're wanting to say that you're a very analytical researcher, include bullet points that show times you have manipulated large data sets using Python. Be clear about what it is you did to get to that you are able to say, I'm an analytical researcher. You should detail responsibilities and skills that you've used. So have any of the projects you've worked on required exceptional teamwork and communication skills? Have inclusivity initiatives that you've helped deliver allowed you to do project management or event management? Have you been part of any science communication activities that show that you are good at public engagement? And in order to do this, what I would recommend is think about what active language would I be able to use to show that I was good at that. So instead of saying something like, I delivered this really cool activity, it would be implemented and delivered event project plan for, I don't know, the Imperial Exhibition Road Festival 2023. And that's how you would manage it. It's those words at the beginning that you implemented and delivered. So you were the person that was responsible for that plan. That shows a reader what you specifically are good at. We think about Samira's CV. These were some of the things that she wrote about in her impact activities, and I have made it slightly bigger to hopefully help you see it. And I've just highlighted the elements that I think demonstrate this. And I would say here that this is what I mean when I talk about the narrative. And also, some of you may already know this or be familiar with this concept, but narrative is storytelling. So the narrative elements of your CV is where you can do most of that storytelling that I talked about before. So some of these activities are not directly related to research. They might be about things like public engagement on Samira's particular CV. And you'll notice here that what she's able to do is she can explain to a reader that she is good at doing things like helping the general public understand complex concepts that they might not otherwise have been able to grasp. She has got some leadership stuff on here. Committee membership shows that she has engaged with the research community. And therefore, all of this is telling a story about not only what kind of researcher she is, but what kind of colleague she would be. So for many academic positions, this extra skill set also might make her highly marketable. And I want to be absolutely upfront about this. I'm sure all of you are well aware of this. It is very rarely the case these days that the only thing you will be recruited on is your ability to do research. Because, and I don't say this to put anybody off, it's just, why not be honest in a group setting like this? There are loads of great researchers, and a lot of them will be applying for the same jobs that you might be applying for. So this storytelling enables you to show that you are actually more than just a researcher. It's above and beyond. It's adding extra points to your CV that might help nudge you to the top of the pile, basically. So these are the kind of things you want to then think about. How do you use this language? So, for example, I really like the fact that, so again, Samira is using very active language. She contributed to government policy. She wrote and presented a 3-hour interactive masterclass. She did something with nanowires. I don't understand that, obviously, English degree. But she did it to 5 groups of school students between the age of 12 and 14. Now, a future employer probably isn't going to ask her to replicate that. They probably don't need her to teach 12 to 14-year-olds if she's going for a postdoc, especially. But the fact that she can work with a different range of people might be interesting to them. It might give them confidence that she's going to perform well at conferences or at outreach activities that the university wants her to get involved in. So Those are the kind of things I mean when I talk about the narrative and the storytelling. And I just want to throw this up there. It's in the CV and cover letter guide. So if you do want to use that, you'll find this on there. But when we talk about action words and the kind of language you should be using in your CV, I appreciate that sometimes that can feel like tricky to know how to do that without being repetitive. So this is sort of a mini thesaurus to sort of get you started thinking about what sort of action words you could use in your CV. So, for example, devised and conducted are quite powerful to have on a CV, because devised tells me you came up with this idea. You didn't just wrote, wrote a paper, wrote a plan, wrote a lesson plan, wrote. Well, that tells me you can write, but devised tells me that you can actually create the content that needs to go in it. Conducted tells me that you can put something into place and see it through to the end. And that's what you want to think about. So if we take, for example, your research skills, if your CV just says over and over again, researched X, researched Y, researched Z, that doesn't necessarily give me all that much information. It tells me, for all I know, you could have been doing purely desk-based research using secondary sources for all of those things. It does not show me the breadth of research skills that you have. Whereas if you differentiated between X and Y data sets in order to establish some kind of nonlinear regression, great, I know you can do that type of research. If you investigate something, if you examine something, if you compile something into a literature review, those are all completely different research skills. And what you would not be doing if you use those active words is selling yourself short. You're not just kind of going, well, I sort of did this. You're being confident and taking charge of the fact, I can classify, I can differentiate, I can investigate. Excellent. So I know that you are a broad researcher with lots of different skills. That's why I recommend that. So the last sort of 10 minutes of what I'm going to cover is general hints and tips. Now this is, the things I'm about to cover now could be relevant for either traditional or narrative CVs, or even for industry ones. These go for any CV. The reason I think that's really important to recognise is no matter what kind of CV you are putting out into the world, no matter what you want to apply for, a lot of the time you are trying to do the same things. Different industries might have different rules, but you are still trying to achieve the same things. You are trying to make a great first impression. You are making sure that you don't undersell the skills that you have, and you are trying to provide evidence for the specific requirements that that role has. And it doesn't matter what format you are asked to use when you do this. This thing that I just want to do is really to reiterate a point I made earlier. And if we remember what I talked about on Samira's CV, a lot of the stuff that I was talking about there was kind of that first impression stuff. So the fact that it's a clear and simple layout, the fact that it's got very good headings and that the bullet points draw the reader's eye, all of that is about layout. And it's not just me saying this. So once you make a CV, the first step is to get somebody to actually read it. And we've known this for years, even before AI was capable of doing this. And this study is quite old now, but basically a study was done, I think sometime in the kind of mid-2000s. And what they did was they tracked where recruiters looked on a CV. So this is like a heat map that they created based on how long somebody's eyes lingered on a particular part of the CV. Now, what I will tell you about these two CVs is that they're actually the same content. So the one on the left is the first draft, and the one on the right is it just rejigged so that it's got a different structure. Hopefully you will notice the same thing I did, which is that the bottom part of the first CV, nobody is looking at it. In fact, just at the sort of right hand side of that second, at the bottom part of the CV, there is a bit of white space that everybody seems to be looking at. And as a former recruiter, I can only imagine a bunch of recruiters staring into the void of that CV and just going, I'm not reading those paragraphs of text. I can't do it. And then just not reading it any further. again, as I said, this is exactly what I meant when I said to you, sometimes if you include paragraphs, it will just get skipped. A reason for that is, and this is largely industry based, but it's worth noting, the average recruiter will look at a CV for about 7 to 8 seconds. And what they will usually do is they will split those CVs into 2 piles. No, I don't want to read any more of this, or maybe. And the maybe pile will be looked at again more closely later. I would personally say that the CV on the left-hand side here would go straight into the no pile, because they have no idea what brilliant stuff this person has done, because they have not looked at any of the content on that second page, because it's not laid out in a way that they are happy to read. By contrast, the second page, the second version of this, you'll notice the attention is much more evenly distributed across the 2 pages. And at the bottom there's what is made a beautiful shape, I think. It looks very kind of like an anime flame. There is a huge amount of attention at the bottom. The reason for that is where the education section is. And for whatever this role was, evidently education was considered important. So this is why it's so important to do things like make sure you have clear headings, make sure that everything is laid out nicely so that it is appealing for somebody to read. And what you've got to think about is that this person doesn't have a lot of time. What is going to be easiest for them to scan through? So hopefully that indicates why I'm telling you to do some of this stuff. It's not just a personal preference, it's because it might actually help you with that. I will also say, just as a really brief aside, if you are applying for a lot of opportunities that do have their own application form, or somewhere like the UKRI where they have a specific template you have to download and follow, it does a lot of this for you, which is great. But for many positions, you also might have to kind of create your own format, and that's where this comes in really importantly. So the overall results of that study showed, hopefully this is now what you were expecting to hear, clear and simple layouts are best. I generally recommend, unless you are applying to be a design engineer, which I think is unlikely for most of the people watching this particular webinar, but unless you are applying for a design kind of role that would expect you to have used, fancy graphics, for example, do not use columns, do not use text boxes, do not use images, because most people find them distracting. I find with a CV that has columns in it, I don't know where to look first. Whereas if it is just really simply laid out, black and white, kind of full lines of text, it's easy for me to know, as somebody who reads left to right in a Western language, that makes it easy for me to read. Clearly marked section and titles and various headers make it a lot easier for me to find the information that I want, especially if I'm having to read quickly. Bold job titles helps as well, because again, it draws that bold text draws the reader's eye to the thing that you did. Bullet points, absolutely helpful. You do not need to use full sentences, particularly full sentences that start, I was responsible for these things. Just start with that active word. Use a clear font. Some of you may be aware that fonts that are a sans serif read better on the screen. So you can decide, well, actually, is that important to me? How, what kind of font do I want to use? I would say you don't want a lot in italics, for example, on your CV, because it actually might be reducing the readability. The most important information should be on the front page, because it makes it easier to find. And the relevant keywords to the job opening should be provided in context of where they are evidenced. Now, that's quite a complicated sentence. What I mean by that is, instead of just having a list that says, great teacher, great science communicator, great researcher, oh, that's great, but you need to provide evidence. So if you want to tell me about your ability to teach, have a section maybe called teaching experience, or at least have a bold job title, supervisor for 3 MSc students, and then underneath in the bullet points provide evidence of the fact that you're good at it. So bullet point, supported improvement of writing style for 3 MSc students, and that tells me what you did to help them. So that's what I mean when I say that you should, if it's relevant, you should provide it in context of where you did it, because that gives the evidence. Hoping that makes sense. when it comes to questions, if it didn't, let me know and I'll try to go back to it. The kind of overall point of this really is that if you can do these 8 things, you will have nailed your CV regardless of what structure it comes. Clear and simple presentation, avoid large blocks of text, and therefore use bullet points. Make it relevant and give evidence for everything that you want to include. Avoid cliche phrases. Now, this one is things like, I'm a dynamic and motivated individual, which I've seen 100 times at the top of CVs, usually in that summary section. I don't know if that's true at that point. I haven't seen any evidence of the fact that you're motivated, apart from the fact you're telling me. If you want to demonstrate motivation or dynamism in your CV, give it a bullet point worth of evidence somewhere later. Similarly, keep your language and tone professional. The easiest way probably to do that is to avoid personal pronouns. You don't necessarily need to use I and my in your CV. Just start with that action word and it keeps it snappy and concise. Write length matters far less in an academic context, I think, as long as it is well balanced across however many pages you need to use, but it should absolutely be proofread. Errors are an easy way to get rid of a candidate. Now, many of you probably aren't including your secondary education on your CVs anymore because you will have other things in place instead. But a really clear example of this, I regularly say to undergraduate students, there is no apostrophe in GCSEs. And if I have 2 perfectly good CVs next to me and they are both potentially appointable candidates, but one of them's put an apostrophe in GCSEs and the other one hasn't, that might be the thing that tilts it into the other person's favour. So errors, if at all possible. I can't see errors in my own work, so I always make my mum proofread things for me. Find somebody you trust or run it through Grammarly, do whatever it is that you need to do to feel that you have presented something that's as high quality as you can get it. Which brings me on to my final kind of point, and this is in 2 parts. I want to talk a little bit in the last sort of 5 minutes about artificial intelligence. Some people don't realise, actually, I think, that many companies are now using AI to read CVs. You do, because I've already told you. But don't worry about it too much. The AI that is being used, they're not massively sophisticated systems, as I think I already told you. They cannot easily read images, tables, or multiple columns. So just don't use those things. If you think there is any danger that it may be an AI that is reading your CV, don't put those things in. It is purely usually trained on keywords, and very often those same keywords can be found in the job description. So what that means is you can look at the job description, pull out what you think are the most relevant keywords, and just make sure that you are providing evidence for those key points in your CV. If you can do that, you're probably going to score quite highly. And I will also just clarify that a human is still quite often actually involved in the process. I've never met a recruiter that says a computer does all of their work for them. So what often happens is, let's say 100 CVs come in for a job, the AI will scan them, and anybody that sort of hits 70% closeness to the job description, they will then be passed on to a recruiter to make the shortlist from there. So it's not as though it's only a machine that is doing this work. That's also why I would probably not recommend that you just take all of the job description, put it into white font and squish it into the footer of your Word document, because that might fool AI. I actually don't think it would, but it certainly isn't going to fool a human that then reads your CV afterwards. That's advice I sometimes see on TikTok, and I recommend you ignore it if you ever see something similar. The other element of artificial intelligence I just want to touch on, because my industry is getting very excitable about generative AI, about ChatGPT and all of the other versions of. And I'm getting a lot of questions from students. Can I use ChatGPT to write my CV? And the answer is yes. As I said right at the beginning, there is no ethical reason you shouldn't. I don't think it is any different to going online and finding a template. Saying to ChatGPT, I'm an early careers researcher in this particular area. Can you help me write a CV? I don't think that's any different. So ethically, morally, go right ahead. If that stops you staring at a blank page, go for it. But you must be aware of the pitfalls. So the pros of this, where it might work really well, is it can give you inspiration. So if you, what you can do with ChatGPT, for example, is you can take some section of the job description, copy it out, put it into ChatGPT and say, could I have some inspiration on how to tailor my CV to include some of these keywords? And it will help you. It will give you inspiration on how to do that. It can absolutely reduce that blank page anxiety. If you can get, some information together as a starting point, great. And also it's possible that you could, if you already have a CV, you could upload that to ChatGPT and the job description and say, please, can you help me review and refine my CV for this particular role? I've not actually done that last one, but I've heard other people have, so that could be something for you to play with. However, thinking about the cons, as with any artificial intelligence program, it is worth noting that if you put garbage in, you will get garbage out. You have to, if you're going to use generative AI, you have to give it good information, or it can only work with what it's got. So if you just say, write me a CV for this job description, but don't tell it anything about you, it can't actually do that. It doesn't know what you did. You have to tell it first. You have to establish that what it comes out with is appropriate for all labour markets. I've been exploring and playing with this, and I have noticed that it definitely has a tendency to write CVs to write US style resumes rather than British style CVs. It doesn't always matter, but there are some key differences. So you have to make sure that it's okay. And basically this final point is the key thing. It requires fine tuning. You cannot just say to ChatGPT, write me a CV, pull that off and send it out. We were recruiting a couple of weeks ago, and I actually saw people had done this with their cover letters. And the reason that I know this is because those cover letters said things like, I would be an exceptional fit for this job because, open bracket, insert evidence here, close bracket, full stop, and it moved on. They had not edited it at all. And that is the key thing. And I would say with artificial intelligence, with anything that you use this for, it is a starting point, but you will still need to do the work to make sure that that it's a CV that you're happy with and that it is tailored to your needs for that role. But if you bear that in mind, go right ahead. So that's the moment. So check everything that comes out, make it personal, tailor it for the specific role, which is basically true of any way that you would handle a CV. And that's me. That is the information that I wanted to offer to you today. I hope that is helpful. And does anybody have any questions? I suppose they would be in the Q&A section. So we'll wait and see.
Yes. So thank you, Jess, for that talk. That was great. Like I say, I've seen some of that before, but interesting to see some new parts and especially how AI has been progressing in the job market. Yeah, please write any questions that you do have in the Q&A box, and we'll put them in there. Oh, there we go. So Patrick's asked, when applying for research positions, they always ask for a CV and personal statement. In terms of a personal statement, wouldn't it feel you are repeating yourself since you are expanding the CV in a sense?
It's a really, really great question. And what I would say with that is that, yes, they in some ways will overlap a little bit, and that is entirely normal. The key difference with a CV, if you think about yourself as a book, can't help it, English degree, but think about yourself and all of the content, most of the book is the stuff you have done, and you have to find a way to concisely explain that to somebody. So your CV is a little bit like a table of contents. It is essentially you saying, here is a list of things I've done, and I'm going to give you a little taster of how I achieved that, so that if you were looking at this just at a glance, you'd be able to pull that together. The personal statement or cover letter in that sense is the introduction. It's you maybe pulling out what you think are the most relevant bits from that CV and saying, I'm going to give you a bit more detail about these, but also I'm going to link all of this to why specifically it makes me a good fit for your role. So in your personal statement, you get to say things like, I am hugely motivated to come to this research group because of your innovative work on X, Y, and Z. This really matters to me, as you'll see from the fact that my thesis focused on A, B, and C, which is in some way linked. So it actually allows you to make specific connections between them, that then the reader can go, oh, I'm just going to have a quick look at the CV and see how long ago that was or when that happened. So yeah, it's fine for them to overlap a little bit because they should be a cohesive whole document. And you can absolutely use them interchangeably in some ways, but they do serve slightly different purposes.
Thank you, Jess. There's another question from Sina. How old should be the content in the CV? For example, an internship undertaken 10 years ago, is it still valuable to mention that?
It kind of depends. There's no right and wrong answer. If you are struggling for space, I usually recommend anything older than 5 years, you don't have to include unless you have a very good reason to do so. But if you're not struggling for space, and actually, if let's say you did an internship 10 years ago, but it is still relevant and you have not done anything since then that you think shows the same skills or the same knowledge base, you could mention it, absolutely. You probably wouldn't give it as much detail as something more recent. As a general rule of thumb, if something is more recent, it is considered more relevant. But if you want to show, for example, that you have been interested in a particular field for a long time, you might mention that you had done an internship 10 years ago because it shows you've been interested for that whole length of time. So you absolutely don't have to. I would recommend probably not if you have other internships since that you think supersedes that experience. But if you have a very specific reason for wanting to include it, there's no rule that says you can't.
Thanks again. So there's no questions in the chat currently. I was just interested myself. So what would you say is the biggest change that has been happening in maybe the past year or two in the job market for researchers?
So in some ways, I will say that, well, probably, so the thing I hear most about in my industry is AI and things like ChatGPT. I did say earlier that most academic researchers probably don't need to worry about that as much at the moment in terms of it being AI that's reading their CV. But actually, I don't know how long that's going to be the case for. At Imperial, we already have the capacity, if we want to scan read application forms and CVs with an application tracking system. So if I'm recruiting for a position in my team, there will be a numerical score when I get those applications through. Currently, I choose to ignore that score, but I cannot guarantee that all universities are ignoring it or that even all departments are ignoring that. So it is worth being aware that that is happening. It's not going to go away anywhere. I think the other thing is probably this probably depends on your personal situations, but things like in the wake of Brexit, the way that the funding changed means that there is a huge difference now, I think, in the types of positions that are available for different researchers. It sometimes is harder to find something that matches your specific kind of, research interests, unless you've got a really good network or unless you're very good at researching what exists in the field. So although that's always been the case that those are good practice things, I would absolutely say that's even more important now, really, to be keeping an ear to the ground, even if you've got quite a long time until you're going to need to apply for something else. And the final point probably is narrative CVs. I think they are becoming far more common from funders. So making sure that you read the instructions carefully when you're applying for things, look for what they're asking for. Are they just asking for a list of what you've done, or do they want to know how you did it, what your contribution was, and just making sure you give them what they've asked for?
Thanks. There's a couple more questions in the chat.
Great.
So Ashley asks, in terms of applying for jobs post-PhD, is there a recommended time frame for reaching out to companies or employers? Is 3 months prior to submitting enough time to get a handle on the job market?
Yes, I would say absolutely is. So if you're going post-PhD, you are probably not applying for one of those industry graduate scheme type roles that recruit a year in advance. So a lot of our undergrad students in their final year will absolutely panic because they're like, oh, it's October, I've just started back and I already have to start applying for jobs that will open next summer. At PhD level, you're in a lot of cases, you actually might be overqualified for those, so you might not be looking at those. Which means you are applying for jobs where there is likely to be one position. And whoever is advertising for that position probably wants you to start reasonably soon. Now, 3 months is a good amount of time. So if you think, for example, let's say a job advert is out for 3 weeks, and then it takes another week to shortlist, another week to organise the interviews, and then the interviews happen. It might be another week until the panel decide who they want to take on, and then they might reach out to somebody, and feasibly that person could say, great, but I've got 8 weeks notice to give in my current job. So it could be 3 months, 4 months until they actually expect somebody to be in place. So I usually say between 3 and 6 months is a good time to start looking. 6 months is probably slightly too early to be applying unless you see something you really, really want. But 3 to 4 months, I think, is absolutely fine.
Just like to speak on that point from personal experience, that if you are thinking about applying, even at 3 months to submission, make sure you are confident in that you will be submitting on that time, as it's never fun to be sat in a job while you're still plugging away at corrections, etc. Not even corrections or even first drafts. So there's not just me, I know quite a few PhDs who've landed in that problem. So be cognizant of that.
Yeah, I think that's the potential caveat with PhDs, is that your end date is a movable feast in some ways. So obviously some of that depends on your personal circumstances. I know that some people need a job as soon as their stipend is going to run out. But also remember that the first job that you get, if you end up kind of going back to your part-time job for a bit while you're putting those applications in, nobody is going to look at your CV and go, oh, I can't believe you were working in a supermarket or in a bar for a few months after you finished your PhD. It's totally normal. So if it does take you a little bit longer to get that first kind of postdoc or that first professional position, that's entirely normal. Don't let it knock your confidence.
And so the final question I've got in the chat here is from Alex. If you have work experience that is relevant as well as work experience that is not, would you put them under the same header?
Excellent question. I almost feel like I've paid some of you to come in and write these great questions, but I haven't. The answer is it probably depends how much experience you've got. So if you've got a couple of experiences and one of them was relevant and one of them wasn't, sure, put them under the same header, because it'll still be really easy for somebody to see, oh, that's the one we most want to focus on. You can also do other visual things, like the one that you think is more relevant, give it a couple more bullet points. That will visually tell me that one's more important because you've talked about it more. If, however, you've got multiple jobs, various experiences, and some of them are relevant, but some of them you want to mention them, but they're not what you think you'll be mostly getting scored on, there is nothing wrong with having a section called relevant professional experience. And the other one can be other experience. And then you can separate them out and push the more relevant ones up the page, even if they're slightly older than some of your non-relevant experiences. As long as it kind of makes sense within that section, that would be absolutely fine. And again, what you'd be doing is making it easier for a recruiter to see what you've done that is relevant.